There's a quiet assumption that still lingers in our culture, almost unexamined, that when a woman lives alone without a man, something must be missing, that the empty chair across the table represents absence rather than choice. But that assumption collapses the moment you actually listen to women who have built lives on their own terms. Because what you find is not loneliness in the way we've been taught to imagine it. What you find is self-possession. Living alone for many women is not a retreat from love or connection. It's a return to themselves. It's the moment when the constant background noise quiets, the need to negotiate moods, manage expectations, absorb another person's emotional weather. And in that quiet, something profound happens. Her nervous system recalibrates. She begins to feel what peace actually feels like in her body, not as an idea, not as a luxury, but as a daily baseline. This is where the misunderstanding begins. From the outside, solitude looks like isolation. From the inside, it often feels like clarity. A woman who lives alone learns the rhythm of her own thoughts. She learns when she's tired, when she's overstimulated, when she needs silence, and when she craves conversation. No one interrupts that learning. No one overrides it. And over time, that attunement becomes a form of power. Because self-possession isn't about control. It's about authorship. When a woman lives alone, her life is no longer a reaction to someone else's needs. Her evenings don't have to be earned. Her mornings don't begin with compromise. She doesn't have to shrink her preferences to keep the peace or dull her instincts to avoid conflict. She gets to notice herself fully, and that noticing changes her. What often surprises people is how much softer, not harder, many women become in this phase. When emotional labour is no longer constant, when vigilance is no longer required, the body relaxes, the shoulders drop, the breath deepens. And from that grounded place, she becomes less reactive, less defensive, less hungry for validation, not because she doesn't want intimacy, but because she's no longer starving. This is where self-possession replaces self-protection. Instead of building walls, she builds discernment. She doesn't need to prove she's desirable, interesting, or worthy of commitment she already knows. And because of that, attention alone no longer moves her. Compliments don't intoxicate her the way they once did. Chemistry doesn't override her judgment. She has learned the difference between excitement and safety, between intensity and intimacy. Living alone teaches her something else that is rarely acknowledged. How much of what we call connection is actually regulation. Many relationships survive not because they are nourishing, but because they numb discomfort. When she removes that dynamic, she is forced, gently but firmly, to learn how to regulate herself, how to sit with emotion without outsourcing it, how to self-soothe without self-abandoning. That skill alone changes how she loves forever. And here's the part that often unsettles people the most. A self-possessed woman doesn't feel the same urgency around partnership. Time stops being an enemy. She is no longer racing against an invisible clock, terrified of being left behind. Her life feels full enough that she can afford to be patient. That patience is mistaken for detachment, but it's actually confidence. She knows that solitude is not punishment. It's an option she already knows how to survive and even enjoy. This doesn't make her closed off. It makes her honest. When she dates, she's not auditioning for security. She's evaluating compatibility. She's paying attention to how she feels in someone's presence, not how impressive they look on paper. Does her body tense or soften? Does her mind feel clearer or more chaotic? Does she feel expanded or managed? Living alone sharpens these questions because there's a peaceful reference point to compare against. It's important to say this plainly. Self-possession is not a rejection of men. It's a rejection of erasure. Women who live alone are not declaring independence from love. They're declaring independence from relationships that require them to disappear. They are no longer willing to confuse endurance with devotion or sacrifice with virtue. If a relationship asks them to give up the calm they've worked so hard to build, the answer is quietly, firmly no. And no is not bitter, it's clean. It comes without drama, without speeches, without the need to convince anyone. That's one of the clearest signs of self-possession, the absence of justification. She doesn't need permission to choose herself because she has already done the work of becoming someone she trusts. There is also a deeper cultural fear at play here. A self-possessed woman disrupts old narratives. She cannot be motivated by shame. She cannot be easily rushed. She cannot be promised a future she is already living. And so she is often reframed as lonely, difficult, or emotionally unavailable, but these labels say more about our discomfort with female autonomy than about her actual inner life. If anything, women who live alone tend to love more deliberately when they do love. They know the cost of intimacy, so they choose it with care. They don't confuse presence with pressure. They don't mistake attachment for depth. And when they invite someone into their space, literal or emotional, it's not because they need saving. It's because they've decided the connection adds something meaningful to an already solid life. This is the truth that often goes unspoken. Living alone doesn't hollow a woman out. It gives her back to herself. It teaches her that her life does not begin when someone arrives, and it does not end when someone leaves. And once a woman understands that in her bones, she doesn't beg for love. She recognizes it when it's worthy of her peace. Because self-possession is not loud, and it is not defensive. It is quiet, grounded, and unmistakable. And a woman who has found it will never again trade it for the illusion of not being alone. There's a familiar story we tell about women who spend long stretches alone. That solitude curdles into resentment, that independence hardens into bitterness, that if a woman doesn't partner quickly enough, she becomes sharp, edged, and impossible to please. It's a story repeated so often it starts to sound like common sense. But when you look closely at the women who have actually lived alone for years, who have built full lives without a man at the centre, that story simply doesn't hold. What solitude does, more often than not, is clarify. It strips away noise. It removes the constant need to adapt, accommodate, explain, and endure. And in that clarity, standards emerge not as demands placed on others, but as boundaries rooted in lived experience. A woman who lives alone learns very quickly what peace feels like, and once you know that sensation intimately, you stop bargaining it away. This is where people get confused. They mistake selectivity for hostility. They see a woman who says no more often, who moves more slowly, who is less impressed by charm or urgency, and they assume she's closed off. But in reality, she's simply calibrated. She knows the emotional cost of chaos now. She knows how long it takes to recover from a dynamic that drains rather than nourishes. And she's no longer willing to pay that price. Solitude teaches her something relationships often obscure patterns. When she's no longer caught in the daily push and pull of partnership, she can look back with clear eyes. She notices what kept repeating, what she kept excusing, what she kept mistaking for love. Not with self-reproach, but with honesty. And that honesty becomes discernment. She doesn't need to analyse someone to death. Her body recognises familiar red flags before her mind has to justify them. This is why her standards feel different now. They're not aspirational, they're evidence-based. She's not asking for perfection or fantasy. She's asking for emotional steadiness, reliability, and depth, because she's lived without them and knows exactly what their absence costs. That doesn't make her demanding, it makes her realistic. There's also an emotional economy that changes in solitude. When a woman is no longer relying on a relationship to structure her time, validate her choices, or soothe her anxieties, she becomes less tolerant of inconsistency. Someone who disappears, reappears, sends mixed signals, or creates unnecessary tension stands out immediately, not as intriguing, but as exhausting. What once might have been interpreted as passion now reads as immaturity. Bitterness, when it does appear, usually comes from a sense of powerlessness. From feeling trapped, overlooked, or forced to accept less than one deserves. Solitude, paradoxically, tends to restore power. A woman who lives alone knows she can survive discomfort. She knows she can handle silence. She knows she doesn't need to contort herself to be chosen. That knowledge softens her. It takes the edge off desperation, and with it, the resentment that often follows. What replaces bitterness is precision. She becomes careful with her yeses because she's learned how costly a careless yes can be. She notices not just how someone treats her when things are easy, but how they handle frustration, disappointment, and difference. She watches whether they respect her time, her space, her need for solitude as much as their desire for closeness. These aren't romantic ideals, they're practical necessities for a woman who values her inner equilibrium. And because her life is already full, she doesn't inflate potential into reality. She doesn't fall in love with who someone could be if they tried harder, healed faster, or wanted more. She listens to what is being shown, not what is being promised. This is often misread as cynicism, but it's actually a form of self-respect learned through experience. It's also worth noticing how solitude reshapes a woman's relationship with conflict. When you live alone, conflict is no longer constant. Your home becomes a place of rest rather than negotiation. So when discord does appear, whether in dating or early relationships, it's no longer normalized. She doesn't rush to smooth it over or take responsibility for emotions that aren't hers. She asks a quieter, more revealing question: does this feel solvable, or does it feel familiar? This is why her standards may feel non-negotiable, not because she's inflexible, but because she's integrated the lesson that peace is fragile. It takes time to build and seconds to disrupt. And she's learned that love that requires constant vigilance isn't love, it's management. She's not interested in managing another adult's moods, ambitions, or sense of self. None of this means she lacks warmth. In fact, many women report feeling more open, more generous, and more affectionate once they stop tolerating what depletes them. When standards are clear, there's less resentment simmering beneath the surface. She doesn't say yes while quietly keeping score. She doesn't stay while secretly preparing her exit. Her boundaries allow her to be present rather than guarded. This is the quiet, irony women with sharpened standards are often easier to love, not harder, if you meet them where they are. They communicate more directly. They don't play games. They don't test affection by withholding it. But they also won't negotiate away their well-being for the sake of being seen as agreeable or low maintenance. The discomfort others feel around this often reveals an unspoken expectation that women should be endlessly adaptable, endlessly forgiving, endlessly available. Solitude breaks that expectation. It shows a woman that her life does not collapse when she chooses herself, and once that truth is internalized, she stops performing flexibility at her own expense. So when you encounter a woman who lives alone and seems discerning, measured, even slow to open, don't mistake that for bitterness. What you're seeing is the result of hard-won clarity. She has learned what drains her and what sustains her. She has learned the difference between companionship and consumption, and she will not unlearn those lessons for the sake of convenience. Because solitude doesn't make a woman cold. It teaches her the value of warmth and how precious it is to give it only where it will be received with care. There's a phrase that makes people uneasy. Even now, she doesn't need a man. It's often heard as an accusation or a rejection, as though independence automatically implies hostility. But when you listen carefully to women who live alone, who have built stable, meaningful lives without centering a partner, the reality is far more nuanced. Not needing a man is not the absence of desire. It's the absence of dependency. And that distinction changes everything. When a woman no longer needs a man to feel secure, chosen, or complete, she stops approaching relationships as lifelines. She doesn't date to fill a gap or soothe a fear. She dates, if she dates at all, from a place of sufficiency. Her life already works. Her home already feels like refuge. Her time already has value. So any man who enters that world is not rescuing her from loneliness. He's being assessed for whether he belongs there at all. This is where the dynamic quietly shifts. Need creates urgency. Choice creates discernment. A woman who needs a man will often tolerate uncertainty, inconsistency, even disregard, because the alternative feels frightening. A woman who does not need a man can afford to pause. She can afford to observe. She can afford to let silence reveal what words try to obscure. Time becomes her ally, not her enemy. This doesn't make her aloof or emotionally distant. It makes her anchored. She knows what her days feel like without negotiation, without emotional turbulence, without having to manage someone else's inner world. And once you know that baseline, you don't rush to disrupt it. You become attentive to small signals that others overlook. Does this person add steadiness or static? Do conversations leave her feeling clearer or more depleted? Does his presence feel like relief or like effort? Because she doesn't need a man, she also doesn't romanticize potential. She doesn't fall in love with intention while ignoring behavior. She doesn't interpret attention as investment or chemistry as compatibility. She has learned that attraction can exist without alignment, and that intensity is not the same as safety. These distinctions aren't theoretical for her, they're embodied. She's lived the difference. This is often mistaken for high standards or emotional withholding. In reality, it's respect for herself and for the seriousness of intimacy. When you don't need someone, inviting them into your life becomes a meaningful act. You're not looking for someone to lean on. You're looking for someone who can walk beside you without pulling you off balance. That requires patience. It requires observation. And yes, it requires saying no more often than yes. There's also a deep honesty that emerges here. A woman who doesn't need a man doesn't pretend to want what she doesn't. She doesn't agree just to keep the peace. She doesn't mold herself to be more palatable, more agreeable, more easily chosen. If she commits, it's because the connection aligns with her values, her rhythms, her future, not because she fears being alone. This is why the men who do enter her life often feel the difference immediately. There's no performative dependence, no subtle pressure to be everything, no unspoken demand to fix, rescue, or complete her. Instead, there's a clear-eyed presence. She's not asking to be carried, she's asking to be met. And that can feel both relieving and confronting. Depending on how comfortable someone is standing on equal ground, it's important to say this clearly. Choosing carefully is not the same as choosing rarely. Some women will still love deeply and often, others will love once or not at all. The point is not frequency, it's intention. When a woman doesn't need a man, she doesn't measure success by relationship status. She measures it by coherence. Does this relationship make her life more honest, more stable, more expansive? Or does it fracture her sense of self? This also changes how endings happen, because she is not clinging to the relationship as proof of worth. She can leave without betrayal. She doesn't stay to avoid failure. She doesn't rewrite her needs to keep someone comfortable. When something no longer fits, she trusts herself enough to step away. That trust is built in solitude, reinforced in self-possession, and expressed through careful choice. There's a quiet confidence that comes from knowing you will be okay either way. It removes the bargaining tone from love. She's not negotiating for crumbs or settling for proximity. She's asking a simple, uncompromising question. Does this enhance the life I've already built? If the answer is yes, she opens fully, generously, without games. If the answer is no, she closes the door gently, without bitterness, without spectacle. And this is perhaps the most misunderstood part of all. A woman who doesn't need a man is not harder to love. She's harder to misuse. She won't stay where she is diminished. She won't confuse intensity with intimacy. She won't mistake persistence for commitment. But if she chooses you, it is not out of fear or lack, it is out of clarity. She is not looking to be completed. She is already whole. She is looking for companionship that respects that wholeness, desire that does not demand self-erasure, and love that feels like an addition rather than a cost. And when that kind of love appears, she recognizes it, not because she needs it, but because it honors the life she refuses to abandon. Because the deepest truth is this: when a woman no longer needs a man, love stops being a necessity and becomes a privilege, and only the rare, steady and genuine are ever invited to share it.